Israel strikes in Qatar just before 4 p.m. Qatar time, 2 p.m. here in London. Explosions were heard in the Qatari capital, Doha. Shortly after, Israel confirmed it had struck inside Qatar itself, targeting senior Hamas leadership, said to be discussing ceasefire negotiations. Benjamin Netanyahu's office posted on X that Israel took full responsibility for the attack. Today's action, it said, against the top terrorist chieftains of Hamas was a wholly independent Israeli operation. Israel initiated it, Israel conducted it, and Israel takes full responsibility. But it quickly became clear that Donald Trump had prior knowledge of the attack. Israeli media said he green-lit the strike. The White House has confirmed to the BBC that it had been notified beforehand. Qatar, well, they have described the strike as a blatant violation of international law. The UN chief, Antonio Guterres, said it was a flagrant violation of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Qatar. Well, let's speak to our correspondents. We'll be at the White House shortly. Let's go to Jerusalem and Paul Adams first of all. Paul, a number of hours since these strikes, but just take viewers through it, anyone who might be joining us now, in terms of the basic facts of what we know and what we don't know.
Yeah, the first thing that we saw was the sight of plumes of smoke rising above the skyline in Doha. And even as the smoke rose, the Israelis put out a statement really quickly saying that they were behind this, that they had targeted in a precise manner a building where the senior leadership of Hamas were meeting. They did not say who they thought was there, and in the hours since then, we have heard all sorts of conflicting reports about precisely who was present and, of course, who may or may not have been killed. We still do not know exactly who was there and how many of those senior Hamas figures were killed. It is possible that this was a meeting involving the top leadership of Hamas, at which they were discussing the latest American ceasefire proposals for Gaza, proposals that were only put out by the White House just a couple of days ago. Neither side, neither the Israelis nor Hamas, have yet responded formally to those proposals, and yet here we are in a situation in which Israel says that it launched this attack. We're not yet being told the details of the attack. We believe that it involved a number of Israeli jets. There is the question of precisely what route they took to get there. But this, if you like, is in keeping with the sort of boldness, that military boldness that the Israelis have been displaying for the past year or so, believing that essentially they can reach out and hit their enemies wherever they are.
Paul, I know you have to get away, so we will leave it there for now, and I'll talk to you again in a little while. But let's go straight to Washington and our North America correspondent, Nomia Iqbal. And Nomia, it is just being confirmed from the White House saying that Israel did notify the United States ahead of time, and that is what White House officials had already told the BBC, isn't it?
It is, but I think it does beg the question, did Donald Trump greenlight it, or did Donald Trump just allow Israel to do this? Now, Israel is saying, as we've been reporting, that this was an operation that it took independent of anybody, that it was entirely conducted by Israel. But exactly, how much support they were given, and one has to assume they were given support by the US, because if Israel notified America, then Donald Trump had the opportunity to say, don't do that, but they went ahead and did it. We'll get more of an understanding of it, Matthew, later on. In about an hour's time, the Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt will hold a press briefing. There is no doubt that this will be top of the agenda in terms of questions. And then also Donald Trump himself will be holding an event later this afternoon. It's open press and will be taking more questions. But just to remind, over the weekend, Mr. Trump did say that he had given his last warning to Hamas to accept a ceasefire proposal, which, as Paul was saying there, Hamas was looking at the details of that. But we'll see. We'll see what further information the Trump administration has to give to us when we hear from the press secretary later, and maybe from the president himself.
And where do you think this leaves any sorts of hopes of pauses, of ceasefires, of peace? Because I was talking to Jeremy Bowen, and his assessment was on the ground now in Gaza, it will be all-out war.
Well, here's the thing. Qatar is a non-NATO US ally, and they were mediating. They were the country that was where Steve Witkoff, the Middle East envoy, was going to carry out negotiations, and now that's off the table. And so Donald Trump, whilst on the one hand it appears that he has obviously is okay with Israel doing this, but at the same time he wants a ceasefire, he wants a peace deal. So it's completely up in the air. It's completely in limbo now. And we'll hear what President Trump has to say. I presume that will be the main question that reporters will ask him, is where does this now leave the ceasefire that he keeps saying is coming. I mean, over the weekend he said we're very close to making a deal, we're very close, but given what's happened today, I think the US is far away from that right now.
Nomia, thanks very much. Let's bring in our security correspondent, Frank Gardner. And Frank, give me your assessment of where we are as we're talking.
Well, do you know, even before this latest Israeli strike on its enemies, it was proving very difficult for effective communications between the Hamas leadership in Qatar and that tranquil Gulf state to communicate effectively with the fugitive fighters hiding out in the rubble of Gaza, because Hamas is shattered as an organization. It's not completely destroyed, but as a military structure, it no longer exists in the way it did on October the 6th, 2023. So already it was proving quite difficult. But this is going to have a lot of ramifications, because the fact that the US knew about it, they would have had to know about it. They've got this massive airbase, the Coalition Air Operations Center at Al Udeid airbase just outside Doha. So, of course, they knew about it. There is, I think, probably going to be a bit of a backlash, both diplomatically from Gulf Arab leaderships who have always viewed the United States as their main strategic partner, but they will be pretty concerned, I think, at this. And also at street level, this will only add to the anger that many people feel in the Arab world, that Israel is simply chucking its weight around the world. They don't see this as just retribution for the atrocities of October the 7th, which is what many Israelis see it as. They see this as Israel being a bully, targeting its enemies wherever it feels like, whether it's in Gaza, South Lebanon, Syria, Iran. Don't forget that Ismail Haniyeh, at the time, back in July last year, was the chief Hamas negotiator, and he was assassinated by a bomb placed in his guest house in North Tehran, right under the noses of the Iranians. So there is so I would see this as part of an ongoing campaign of retribution by Israel, taking out its enemies and basically trying to warn people off carrying out attacks on the Jewish state, as they put it.
And of course, it also begs the question around international law.
Yeah, it's been widely condemned, not just by Qatar, but by Saudi Arabia, and indeed by the UN Secretary General, who is he doesn't have too many admirers in Israel, but Antonio Guterres has called it a flagrant or blatant transgression of international law. And Israel has obviously decided this time it's not going to bother to keep any mystery about it. It's immediately taken responsibility. It said that it was carried out using 15 Israeli Air Force jets, using 10 munitions, in conjunction with the Shin Bet, which is Israel's internal domestic intelligence organization. Clearly, even though Khalil al-Hayya and other Hamas leaders are based overseas in Qatar, Israel clearly viewed this as a domestic situation. There is a precedent here, although it's a much less dramatic one. So back in early 2010, two Mossad agents, Mossad being the overseas spy agency of Israel, they went to Dubai, disguised as tennis players, got into the hotel where somebody called Mahmoud Mabhouh, who was a founding member of Hamas's Izzuddin al-Qassam brigades, and they assassinated him in a UAE hotel. There was a big diplomatic fuss about it. I have a feeling that they were using forged passports belonging to Canada and even the UK. But there was also another precedent back in 1997 when Mossad agents targeted Khalid al-Mish'al, who was in Jordan at the time, and they injected him with a poison and Jordan managed to arrest them and force them to provide the antidote.
Frank, stay with me because I just want to break away from you for a moment or two, because BBC Verify has authenticated CCTV footage appearing to show the moment a building in Doha was struck today. Well, using Google Street View, Verify has geolocated the street, and there, well, you see the cameras shaking and moving in, but that is the building that we've seen in other footage as well, where apparently this meeting was actually happening. We still have to learn in terms of casualties, how many, if any, of those Hamas leaders survived those blasts. But there you see the building in the moments it was struck and the consequences, the debris, the smoke, the flames, and we know a number of strikes. So that the footage that has been verified by our colleagues at BBC Verify. Frank, let me bring you in as we just stay with those images, because as well as the many strategic implications, geopolitical implications, the families of hostages will be watching all of this. And I'm just going to read one quote from one family, and it was from Einav Zangoka, who posted on X, "I am shaking with fear around my son Matan, who is being held. It could be that in these very moments the Prime Minister has actually assassinated my Matan." So you can see from what I've just read out, there must be enormous alarm about the implications for all of those hostages still being held.
Yeah, with good reason, I think, because, you know, the fear of reprisals will be right uppermost in their minds. Let's not forget that it was Qatar where the initial post-October the 7th negotiations took place that resulted in the freeing of a large number, quite a substantial number of Israeli hostages, in return an even bigger number of Palestinian prisoners who were released from Israeli jails. And that was the biggest, most successful release, or the most successful ceasefire negotiation, I think, that was hosted by the Qataris. And it's very hard to imagine how any kind of ceasefire or peace negotiations could now take place in Qatar, given what's happened. The Qataris are absolutely furious. They have provided a base in good faith. It's a tranquil, peaceful Gulf country where this kind of thing is almost unheard of. I mean, I say almost because, of course, they were targeted by Iran earlier this year in June during the 12-day war between Israel and Iran, in which Iran fired back at Qatar because it hosts a big US base. But it was a very limited strike, and all the Patriot missiles were able to shoot down everything that Iran fired at it. But the Qataris are really angry about this. And I think they'll have questions for the Americans here because, as I say, they host this huge, big US base at Al Udeid, something called the Coalition Air Operations Center. It is the node from which the US and its allies, including the UK, they coordinate all air operations, military air operations around the entire CENTCOM, that's the US Central Command area, from Egypt to eastwards to Afghanistan and Iran. And the Qataris are going to be, I think, having some pretty serious discussions with the United States. If you knew about this, why didn't you tell us? Well, obviously because they, there perhaps might have been some kind of a tip-off, but I think there will be quite a strained diplomatic relationship, I think, for the time being. It's also going to rattle the region because, as we've heard earlier, this is a continuation, Matthew, of an entire program ever since the October the 7th Hamas-led raid from Gaza into southern Israel, an entire campaign of Israel to take out its enemies wherever it sees them, whether it's in Gaza, in South Lebanon with Hezbollah, those pages, if you remember, that were booby-trapped, even following the overthrow of the horrible regime of Bashar al-Assad and President Bashar in Syria. They carried on attacking, targeting Syrian air bases during this year. They have carried out assassinations in Iran and in Yemen. The Houthis, of course, in Yemen are firing missiles at Israel. So it's fighting on a lot of fronts. And let's not forget what's going on in the West Bank, where settlers are using the fact that they have got a pro-settler security minister in power in the cabinet to try and steal more and more land from Palestinian families in the West Bank.
Frank Gardner, thanks very much once again. And again, I will return to you in the coming minutes, but let's go live to Jerusalem and our correspondent, Paul Adams. And Paul, I'm just reading here the latest being reported by the Reuters news agency, quoting Hamas officials telling Al Jazeera TV that the leadership survived Israel's attack on Doha. Well, we shall see and try to find out more details. But are you hearing anything more in terms of basically casualties here after this attack?
No, not really. Nothing official, at least. I mean, there are lots of Israeli media reports saying, that 6 or 8 people might have been present, and that quoting unnamed officials saying that, many of them were killed. We just don't know. I think we're going to have to wait for a proper assessment by the Israelis and also a formal announcement from Hamas. At some point, Hamas are going to have to come out and say who was killed and who survived. Someone will have to appear in front of a camera. Arrangements for funerals will have to be made. All of these sorts of things will make it clear precisely what the outcome of this operation was. In the meantime, we've had 2 or 3 statements now from the Israeli government. The last one I've seen said that the decision was taken partly in light of yesterday's attack here in Jerusalem, in which 2 gunmen boarded a bus and killed 6 Israeli civilians. Hamas said nothing yesterday, but today it claimed responsibility for that attack. And the statement from the Prime Minister's office and the Defense Minister also said that yesterday, after the murderous attacks in Jerusalem and Gaza, because there were some Israeli soldiers who were killed in the war in Gaza also yesterday, the Prime Minister directed security elements to prepare for the possibility of striking the Hamas leadership. But the statement goes on to say that this afternoon, in light of an operational opportunity, the decision was actually taken. So this does raise a whole bunch of questions about precisely when the decision was taken to mount this kind of operation. I think the Israelis, who will be watching Hamas officials like hawks all around the region, just as they were with the killing of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran last year at the funeral of the Iranian president, they will have known where these figures were, will have been watching the buildings where they were known to congregate, and will have seen them all there, presumably gathering to discuss the latest American ceasefire proposals for Gaza, and they just could not resist the opportunity to kill them all in one fell swoop. Whether they have or not, we just don't know.
Paul, I was just reading out one quote from one hostage family, but there is a forum that represents the larger group. Have they said very much since these details, this attack emerged?
I know that there is a statement from the forum. I don't have it in front of me right now, Matthew, but we've heard from a couple of the families really kind of anguished statements saying that in effect they fear that this operation will have condemned their loved ones to death in Gaza. As many as 20 hostages still thought to be alive, held in the Gaza Strip. Of course, the hostage families, many of them, not all of them, but most of them, have for months and months been attacking the government, accusing the government of failing to take the interests of the hostages into account and of taking actions that are likely to jeopardize the lives of the hostages. And of course, they will feel that this is another such moment and possibly a really decisive and grim moment because, if the channels of negotiation have been shut down by this, then the fear is going to be that those individual Hamas figures holding hostages in Gaza may wonder what the point of continuing to hold them alive is. It is a very real fear, and it is being voiced in a number of quarters tonight.
And there will also be broader fears across Gaza as well, because I suppose for optimists, they may have looked at the situation and thought Israel was carrying out a sort of multi-track approach, but it increasingly looks like a one-legged strategy, and that is a military strategy, and that is it.
it is in keeping with the attitude and the strategy of the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu over the past 2 years, the complete and utter defeat of Hamas as a political and a military organization. Of course, it is an opportunity, another opportunity for the government to say, job done. We have destroyed Hamas, pretty much utterly. We've destroyed its leadership abroad. We have completely demolished its ability to threaten Israel in the way that it did on October the 7th 2 years ago, and that this could be an opportunity to say that the war has been won and that therefore can come to an end. I think that decision will depend a lot on the attitude of the Trump administration. If indeed Donald Trump knew about this in advance and gave a green light, was there a strategy? Is there a strategy there that would somehow involve putting pressure on the Netanyahu government to say, it's time to bring this to an end? We don't know. We're speculating like crazy about all of these things. But it does seem as though the operation in Doha and the actions that we're seeing in the Gaza Strip in the last few days and weeks all point in one direction, which is that Benjamin Netanyahu is pursuing the military objectives really until there are no military objectives left to pursue.